Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am back for my LPL Round 4 playoff overview and analysis of both of the upper bracket series. Now, we're going to be splitting this up just a tad bit different than what the LPL is doing. Of course, I think this as well as the lower bracket game are all considered Round 4, but I want to get previews out for every single series that comes along, so we're going to be segmenting these a little bit different. Today, I'm going to be going over the two upper bracket series between TES, EDG, and then, of course, JDG and LNG. And then later on this week, you guys are going to be seeing different segmented versions of winners finals, losers semifinals, losers finals, and the grand finals throughout the week. So it's going to be a little bit different than normal here for the LPL, just so that I can make sure to get my previews in for all of the series that are left. But that leaves us with two series to talk about today, and they are both going to be a blast to talk about. So, if you guys are excited for that, let me know down in the comments section below. Obviously, some really interesting things. Let me know how you feel about these series, about what you expected. Did it meet your expectations? Were the games fun for you? Let me know all of that down in the comment section below. But let's go ahead and not waste too much more time. Let's jump into our first series of Round 4. And our first series of Round 4 was a matchup between Top Esports and Edward Gaming. TES versus EDG, a very intriguing matchup. There is a real case to be made that this is a matchup of the two best teams in the region. TES obviously kind of being the best team in the region throughout a majority of the year so far. EDG really picking up the pace recently, really finding their style and capitalizing on all the talent that they have. Remember, this team won the World Championships last year. It's not like they're just some schmucks thrown together that are getting hot at the right time. So, a very intriguing matchup here between these two. We knew that it was going to be back and forth, but my key matchup was going to be the bot lane. If Jackie Love could hold up and be better than Viper, TS had a good shot. If Viper really took over the series, I could see EDG having a good shot. So, definitely interesting. A lot of things to look out for here, but let's go ahead and jump right into Game 1 here. And Game 1 was a big EDG win. They actually start off the series with a big shot, and that's huge for them. Really like this draft from EDG. I think it really gives you a lot of options. Not only do you have a significant amount of go button here with, obviously, Wukong engages just for straight up, and then the Sivir ultimate to help him get in there, but Kennen flanks, you have Lissandra for counter engages, you have the Yuumi for engage as well, and then the Sivir just to do a bunch of damage in the backline with assistance from the Wukong, from the Kennen. Really like that this gives you a ton of options for how to play the late game. I will say it's a little bit early game weak, but overall that didn't really matter because EDG played it really, really well. I should note that for the entire series here, JJ is in the jungle. It looks like they're going to be sticking with JJ. I think that's fine as long as the game plan doesn't change all that much because obviously Junjie came in, kind of reinvigorated what EDG was doing over the course of the year, mostly because he realized that Viper was the best player and he wanted to play around him. So as long as JJ can continue to keep that up, I really like what EDG was doing here. But honestly, big shout out to Scout in this game on the Lissandra. It is very rare that you get a super duper active Lissandra like this in the early game, but Scout plays a little bit different than I think a majority of mid laners. He was going into the Ahri here, a really good matchup for the Lissandra. I've talked about that all year long, but Tian and Jackie Love were his targets this game, and it wasn't even all that close. Anytime that Xin Zhao was trying to make a play in the early game, Scout was there to stop it, gaining kills, helping JJ out a lot. Like, this was just a very active game from Scout overall, which is something you don't often see from the Lissandra. That's somewhere where I think the Ahri can get generally a leg up, is that she's just significantly more active on the map typically than Lissandra is, but a very good job from Scout to be able to help out his jungle, to be able to help out his bot lane in the mid game. He's going to get player of the game for that. He was everywhere on the map. It was actually insane. He played it really well, and you've got to credit the rest of the team as well. JJ in the right place at the right time. Going into Xin Zhao, I always talk about how Xin Zhao is kind of weak right now, and I do agree with that still, but it can still be a little bit of a problem before 10-ish minutes because he just has so much to deal with you, and especially if you're going to be fighting around that bot lane with a Lucian Nami, it's just very rare that you're going to be able to actively outplay that. But with Scout there to create a numbers advantage, and JJ honestly playing super duper well here on the Wukong, it actually pretty much completely null and voided the advantage that TES had in draft in terms of the early game and indexing super hard into the early game, which obviously they did here with Xin Zhao, Lucian Nami. So overall, just a really good game from the jungle mid duo. Viper and Mako definitely stepped up and did their part here on the Sivir Yuumi. Obviously, going into Lucian Nami can sometimes be a little bit of a problem, at least in the early game, but if you actually can get ahead of them in any way, even towards the mid game, like, you're just going to snowball so completely out of control over them because you're always going to have the range advantage on Sivir, and Yumi's going to keep you protected. You already have the spell shield. Like, it's just such a safe lane. You have Lissandra just in case somebody goes all in on you. Like, you have so many things to keep you safe in that lane, and Sivir does a bajillion damage in the last half of the game, so overall, just a really, really good early game. Flandre was there. He was fine. Again, not really that impactful of a top lane matchup, but overall, I would say the jungle mid duo was really, really good from EDG and was kind of the carry point here for what was an overall completely dominant EDG win. As for top esports, honestly, just not a good game. Really no other way to put it. This was about as bad as it gets for a game 1 here in the playoffs for them, but obviously no panic button yet. Just pointing out that Tion won the MVP under very controversial circumstances. I think we can all agree. Not sure many of us had Tion as our MVP favorites going into the award selection process. Wins the MVP, and then just does not even remotely show up here in the playoffs to start the game 1. Really bad game on the Xin Zhao. Jackie Love just gets outplayed in the bottom lane. I mean, the Lucian Nami lane did not work at all because Scout just had more roam prio than Knight did the entire game. And eventually you just get to the point where it's like, it's unwinnable. It was unwinnable probably by 15, 20 minutes for top esports. And that's not a particularly great sign. Like I said, not a good game from Tion. He's going to get my dud of the game here in game 1. He has games like this sometimes. He had a lot of them last year on FPX where it was just like, why? Like, what are you doing? The Xin Zhao pick, I think, overall is not all that good. I think this is a pretty prime example of why. It's a jungler that indexes super hard into the early game, but even then isn't all that unstoppable in the early game. And so if you just have really good pathing and if you have outnumbering, like, situations, like, even Xin Zhao, Lucian, Nami isn't all that favored in the early game if you just outplay it, and if that trio gets behind, it's, like, unwinnable. So overall, I just hate the draft from top esports. I don't think it really works at all. They didn't really play it all that well either, but, you know, I think there are things to be fixed here. Knight didn't play all that bad, I guess, but, like, the end of the day, like, did it really even matter? Like, Tion and Jackie Love got so outplayed, and Mark as well. Just got so outplayed by Scout, JJ, Viper, Mako. Like, those 4 were just so much better than everybody else on TES this game that it didn't really matter if anybody played, like, remotely okay. It was all just about, like, minimizing the problem, minimizing the damage. So, overall, not a good game from top esports. A lot of things that I would expect to see them fix. Most notably the early game. Like, if they can just not have this early game, like, they'll probably be fine. But a pretty off-brand game, I would say, overall for TES. It's a huge win, though, for EDG. You got to be very, very excited about that if you're an EDG fan, because, I mean, holy crap, like, you just demolished TES. That's really, really good. So, that is game 1. But can EDG continue the momentum now moving into game number 2? And they cannot. TES does bounce back here. A very, very big win from them to even the series up at 1. Keep things kind of within. I always talk about going up 2-0 in a series is kind of a killer for a lot of teams. It's just really difficult to beat a team like EDG or to beat a team like TES 3 games in a row. It is a really difficult proposition to say, like, this is now what you have to do. But TES is not going to put themselves in that situation. I love their draft here. I go from hating their draft to loving their draft. I think a lot of really good options here. EDG with some interesting decisions as well, flexing the Sejuani into the jungle. We've seen that multiple times from multiple teams on this patch in particular. Not only LNG, but we've seen it a bit in the LCK as well, where Sejuani is getting flexed into that jungle spot. I actually think Sejuani is a perfectly fine jungler. You can bring Jackson to really counter that Renekton. It's a really good pick in the top lane if you can make it work. Obviously, if you can get to that late game while being relatively even or ahead, you're going to be a huge nuisance, and especially with the Sylas, like the side lane pressure that EDG is going to offer in this game is going to be devastating. Unfortunately for them, they just never were able to get to that point. TES played the early game significantly better. Jackie Love got super ahead here on the Zeri. I think broadcast game player of the game to Jackie Love, I totally understand, but for me, this is one of the most Giga Chad Braum games I've seen in pro play in a very, very long time. So Mark is going to get my player of the game. It's just usually very difficult to actively show up and show out, like be an MVP caliber player on Braum, but he made this Draven's life a living hell. Draven was not only doing 0 damage, but I mean, he was getting stunned into place over and over again, giving Zeri so many opportunities to kill him. Then you had someone like Knight on the Akali coming bot lane, and Knight multiple times just completely outplayed Viper, and that, you know, caused Viper to get super far behind on the Draven. If you're not snowballing on Draven, you're pretty weak overall, especially into something like Zeri with this much protection. It's going to be a very difficult matchup. I think Mark did a phenomenal job of that, and that's why Mark is going to be my player of the game here in Game 2. I can't even believe that this guy was teamless just a few months ago. It's pretty insane, but, I mean, congratulations to Mark on really being able to completely turn his career around after some, he got dropped off of LGD and just wasn't really able to be, like, a spotlight player and just comes back here to a top team here in TES and just looks great. Like, honestly, like, I'm just super impressed with how Marcus played all year long. He didn't make my all-pro teams, but he was very close. He had a very, very good year, and he really showed up in this game. But yeah, props to Jackie Love as well. He was set up a lot here by the Braum, by the Akali, by the Wukong, even by the Renekton in the later half of this game. But you gotta give credit to the Zeri because she's the one doing the damage. His positioning on Zeri was phenomenal. She was always in a position to do significantly more than Viper or never really be punished by JJ or Mako on any sort of engage. So overall, I think Jackie Love just did a very, very good job in this game. But you also got to give credit to Knight. I think Knight was also a huge performer. Like I said, multiple times where Knight just goes and outplays Viper. And I think that's really impressive. Knight on these more aggressive picks. Obviously, we saw the Ahri in Game 1, but the rest of the team was just kind of a disaster. But the Akali here in Game 2, I think, is right up his alley. Something that he can really impact the entire map on while also being able to have his own resources, right? I think that's exactly what you want out of what is, in my opinion, your MVP player here. Tion had a good game, not all that impactful. Really, this was the bottom three, I think, that were kind of carrying this, but Tion played well. Wayward dominated that top lane matchup here against the Jax. Jax, like I said, can be a pretty difficult matchup for Renekton if you don't get ahead on the Renekton early, but Wayward got some gold, was able to impact the team fights a little bit more, and the Jax side lane pressure wasn't really all that big of a deal. So overall, I think Top Esports, a much better draft, and they played it much better as well. As for EDG, definitely not the bounce back game you want. Your bot lane just got completely clapped. There's really no other way to put it. Viper's going to be my dud of the game here on the Draven. Yes, the Braum just completely countered him, but like he still was a basic non-factor in this game. I'm not saying it's entirely his fault as the player, but he was certainly the least influential player on the map here in Game 2. Mako a very close second, really doing absolutely nothing in the game. Overall, the Rakan pick just did not work. I don't really know exactly who you're going on as Rakan here. You're not ever going to be able to get on Zeri or Akali, so I don't really know what the whole point of, like, charming Braum or charming Renekton or Wukong is. It's something I just don't particularly understand, but at the end of the day, shout out Mako. He showed up and it was not all that good. Shout out this bot lane. They didn't really have it in Game 2. I think they can definitely turn it around, but Game 2 definitely wasn't all that for them. And then I think the other problems were the top lane and the jungle. I think Scout was fine in the mid lane, got completely out-macroed by Knight. Knight was everywhere, most specifically bot lane, a lot, but Scout didn't have like that many individual problems. You had Flandre and JJ here, just got outplayed by their respective counterparts. Wukong was significantly more impactful because the Sejuani needs just more time to get to that point where she needs to be than Wukong does, so unfortunately, Sedge just kind of never got to that point because her team got behind. And then, like I said, Wayward just outplayed Flandre in the top lane on the Renekton, a matchup that you should be able to win before 10 minutes. So overall, a good game from Top Esports, a really good bounce back, especially from the bottom lane here and Knight. But for EDG, I'm not pulling the plug yet. This is just one of those games where, like, things went out of control pretty early. Viper just was never going to get online through the Draven, and by that point, the game was just over. So it's one of those FF just run it back, like, now we just start our regular season best of 3. So some very exciting play through the first couple games here. But it's definitely, it's anybody's series. This is certainly not locked in by any means, is what I mean to say. So moving into Game 3, who is going to separate themselves? Who's going to put themselves under series point in Game 3? It is going to be EDG that actually picks up a big Game 3 win here. Again, off of the back of Viper, this was an unreal bounce-back game. We were just talking about how he got completely outplayed in the bot lane on the Draven. He pulls out the Lucian, and it's really just unfair. Like, Viper's Lucian is actually just unfair. This is a champion that you just cannot allow him to have because he will win the game by himself, and he absolutely, he did. Like, Mako played really well. I want to give Mako a big shout-out, but, like, Viper's Lucian is actually just genuinely unfair. It is just not really all that promising and fair to play into. Like, I don't know what you do. His champion just does more damage. I can't tell you why. He is awesome. He's easily player of the game here in Game 3. A really good bounce back. Obviously, when Viper does well, this EDG team typically does well, and that very much continued in this game. Gotta give a shout out to Mako. The Nami is usually the most forgotten part of the Lucian-Nami duo, but even with Viper kind of styling on a bunch of people multiple times throughout the game, a lot of those damage increases, a lot of keeping him alive. You got to give credit to Mako and the Nami as well. That is a duo lane for a reason. Viper can't just 1v5, and Mako did a really good job of keeping up with him, even if Viper was the one that I think was actively making a lot of the really good plays here for EDG. Big shout out to Flandre as well in the top lane. Gotta give credit to the Ornn. Not typically do you go for like a super team fight comp around Lucian-Nami, but Ornn, Swain, even Vi to an extent, this is very much a team fight comp that wants to 5v5, and Viper really took advantage of that. He got super far ahead in the early game to the point where his callings in late game team fights were doing 8 billion damage to anybody. Gwen, Wukong, Lissandra, even through Lulu ultimate. Like, it just did not matter. He was killing everybody, and a lot of that was helped out by Ornn ultimate, by Swain being legitimately unkillable in team fights as he does. Overall, just a really good game. JJ played the early game really well on the Vi, making sure that Viper was safe, but also making sure that Scout had some opportunities to not get super far behind in the mid lane. Overall, just a really good early game and mid game and late game, I would say, overall, from EDG. Just a really, really solid, complete game from the former world champions. But for Top Esports, I honestly don't even think this was all that bad from them. I actually think they played kind of okay, and I would say significantly better than their score lines would say here, and that the scoreline overall would say. They definitely tried to hold their own in this game. Knight actually made some really interesting plays here. Really sick TP from him in the mid game that I think in a lot of other circumstances would absolutely have worked out. But overall, just did not. Viper was too far ahead. You were never going to be able to contest him. Jackie Love and Mark really got behind, and then Tian just kind of kept expediting that process a little bit. Tian's going to get my dud of the game here, again here in Game 3, just like he got in Game 1. Another kind of rough game. I would say he was the only player in the game that I wasn't completely sold on being all that impactful. I thought Wayward definitely had his moments here on the Gwen. He actually played really well at certain points. And even Jackie Love and Mark, like, yes, Viper was super far ahead, but the Zeri was still doing a lot of damage towards the back half of that game. It just wasn't nearly enough. And like I said, Knight definitely tried to make some really good macro plays, but he was just behind as well. Tian was really the only one where it was like, okay, man, like, you're just giving gold over at points. So definitely going to dock him for that. But overall, like, I don't actually think TS was that bad in this game. I know the scoreline might not lead into that, but I think this is totally salvageable. Like I said, it's always just early game between these two teams. And really what this meta right now is a lot of teams are getting a pretty big lead on one carry in the early game, like pre-15 minutes. And if you're the team that gets that, you're often the team that is going to win. And in this series, it's just so happened to be Viper a few times, or Scout making some really good plays around the map on Lissandra in Game 1. But in Game 2, we saw the same thing here on Jackie Love. We saw it on Tian. We saw it on Mark, right? Like, we saw them be able to create those advantages themselves. So I really think the early game is becoming very important, but you don't want to index too early in that because it gives you no options in the late game. I think that EDG's draft is basically the perfect combination of that. You have the Lucian-Nami as well as the Vi to be able to punish a lot of the bot lane pressure that Zeri and Lulu lack in the early game. But you also have the Ornn and the Swain, and Lucian's damage in the late game still scales, especially if he's ahead, to be able to teamfight later to be able to close that game out. So overall, really do like EDG's draft here. I think it's just slightly better than TES's, and I think the execution diff was definitely there. But that's Game 3. We move on now to Game 4. Can EDG close out the series in 4 games against the #1 seeded Top Esports? In Game 4, they cannot. Top Esports does take Game 4 here, and we're set to a Silver Scrapes Game 5, but let's talk about the 4th game here. This was the Tian bounce back game, and this is exactly what you needed to see if you were a Top Esports fan. You were probably getting a little bit concerned with the macro of this team overall, because quite frankly, their macro in this series hadn't been all that good, outside of some really interesting plays by Knight in the mid lane on the Akali in the Game 2, even on the Lissandra in the Game 3, but Game 4 really showed off, I think, some of the best of what the series has. This bot lane matchup has been an absolute joy to watch. We have one game where Viper completely pops off, and then the next game where Jackie Love completely matches him here on the Sivir into the Zeri Lulu. An absolute blast to watch here. But Tian is definitely my player of the game here on the Sejuani. Those ultimates were absolutely devastating. His frontline ability towards the back half of this game, and really just his ability to control the map over JJ in this one was the difference maker, and he's easily going to get my player of the game here. Even though a lot of what he did was enabling Jackie Love and enabling Knight to do a lot of what they wanted to do, without Tian, I think that's become significantly harder. His map pressure early was phenomenal, and that's another index towards like the don't draft Xin Zhao contingent that I'm on right now, where I just don't think he's all that good of a champion. We've seen that throughout the series. The early game pressure of Xin Zhao can be completely countered if you just create a numerical advantage, even if you have the early game champions to back him up, and in this game, they didn't. They just had the Xin Zhao. Yes, you have the Renekton in the top lane, but you're going into a Gnar who can just play safe for 10 minutes and just kind of wait it out to the point where Gnar's going to be able to outscale Renekton pretty hard. Wayward honestly played the late game here very well on the Gnar, and so I just don't get the Xin Zhao pick overall. The Sejuani, something that is punishable in the early game, was able to get a pretty huge lead just from better macro, from being able to move along with her mid lane, from being able to get the bot lane ahead, from just playing better. There's really no other way to put it. From Tian just being the better jungler in this game. And so Tian's going to get the player of the game, and unfortunately JJ's going to get the dud of the game. But you got to give a lot of credit to Jackie Love for being the quote-unquote carry in this game, right? Like, you can talk about how Tian was a huge influencer and why he was probably the reason that Sivir had a lot of options in this game, but overall, it was still a lot on Sivir. You had the Yuumi on her back, you had the Sylas going in, trying not to die, Gnar engages towards the back half with Sejuani on the front line. A lot of this was predicated on that Sivir damage coming out, and Jackie Love very much performed in that game. So, overall, I think everybody on TES did their job. Big credit to Knight, big credit to Jackie Love, big credit to Mark, big credit to Wayward, but player of the game for me does go to Tian. As for EDG, I just don't like this draft at all. Like I say, Xin Zhao paired up with Renekton, it's indexing very hard into a lane in the early game that can just be completely ignored. And that's essentially what they did is, you know, I think they wanted to try and punish the Gnar, but Wayward just played super safe. He got to the point where he could just outscale the Renekton. He could actively win the 1v1, and he went into those team fights and had some phenomenal ultimates, and that was it, right? Like, JJ made no impact on the bottom lane. The Sivir was super far ahead. Sylas had a ton of gold in the mid lane because he's going into an Azir, which I always hear is this good matchup for Azir, but I don't see it. Like, I don't see that. Like, even just, like, I get it in the 1v1, I can see where Azir can be, like, annoying to play into for Sylas, but, like, Sylas just leaves. Sylas just goes bot lane and gets a bunch of kills there. Like, I don't really understand why this is such a bad matchup for Sylas. Every time we've seen it in pro play, the Sylas has just been significantly more proactive on the map and has continuously been able to generate leads and just be more efficient than what the Azir is in the mid lane. So overall, I don't get it, but, you know, good on Knight. And then, like I said, Jackie Love and Mark with the carry. But yeah, overall, just don't like the draft. You're indexing a lot into the early game here with the Xin Zhao, and you don't really have a lot of follow-up for it. You really need to invest in that Zeri Lulu lane, because if the Sivir gets ahead, like I always say, that Sivir versus Zeri matchup, one of the most even matchups in the game, whichever one gets ahead in the early game is going to snowball the game out of control. Unfortunately for EDG, they didn't really index into the bottom lane, and so that was Sivir for top esports. Definitely a little disappointing here. You want to see more out of JJ, especially if he's going to be playing an early game initiator like Xin Zhao, but overall just not a good game from JJ, not a good game from EDG. What does this mean? Well, we've had a couple of games now back and forth where it's like EDG looks unstoppable, EDG looks unwinnable, EDG looks unstoppable, EDG looks unwinnable. Like, it's definitely been a back and forth series for them, definitely no consistency, but it's been fun to watch, and I think especially this bot lane matchup has certainly been a treat. There was a reason it was my key matchup. It has been an absolute joy to watch Jackie Love and Viper go head-to-head in this series, and I really think that the winner of those two in their matchup here in Game 5 is really going to make a difference. So, is that going to remain true? Let's go ahead and move on to Game 5, and the winner of Game 5 was Top Esports. TES being able to take the series in 5 games. Very, very close, and a very good effort put up by EDG, especially in their wins, but overall, TES is able to come out with the very big win here. The very, very, very big win. And honestly, there were quite a few options for player of the game. I believe Broadcast gave it to Knight on Talia, and obviously Knight plays a really good Talia, but for me, like, Wayward looked phenomenal in this game on the Gnar. Multiple engages that looked great. Sometimes being a Gnar into a Kennen can actually be a pretty negative matchup because you lose kind of your only trait in lane, and then also Kennen just can have your ability but better to flank in a team fight here on the Kennen. So overall, a little bit of a scary matchup for Wayward, but he plays it so ridiculously perfectly. Some unbelievable engages from that Gnar in the top lane. Some of the best that I've seen, honestly, all year coming out from Wayward. So for me, Wayward is going to be getting my player of the game here in Game 5. He was genuinely awesome in this game and in this series, but really, when he got on the Gnar in Game 4 and in Game 5, he really was able to take over a lot of what this team wanted to do. And for me, honestly, big shout out to Mark on the Tahm Kench. You don't see a lot of flashy Tahm Kench play, at least outside the LCK, because we certainly get some there, but you don't really see a lot of flashy Tahm Kench play, especially when it's paired up with Senna, where you want to be a little bit more passive, but I think Mark correctly recognizes that EDG also has a very passive team comp. They've got the Lissandra, they've got the Aphelios, they've got the Kennen, a lot of things that want to move into the late game and be able to 5v5 team fight. And so he plays it really aggressive in the early game. He tries to make a lot of plays happen with Knight, with Tion, and I really think that that helped out TES a ton here. And Mark overall had a really great series. Honestly, in my opinion, he's pretty clearly the player of the series here for Top Esports. You can talk what you want about Jacula being great, Knight being really good, Wayward having some good games, but for me, Mark was the guy on Top Esports in this series that I think really stood out to me as the player of the series for Top Esports in their games here. So big shout out to Mark. It's incredible to see the kind of turnaround he's had, and he had a phenomenal playoff series here for Top Esports. But yeah, credit to Knight. He still played really well in the Talia, was making a lot of plays. I just think he did a lot of them with Mark. I think you can credit that Tahm Kench for a lot of it. Overall, just a good game from TES. A lot of early game proactivity from a team that recognized that if they got to the 5v5s at relatively even, EDG was probably just going to have more damage than they were. So they played exactly to their win condition, and, you know, they got there. So congratulations to them, even after, you know, some interesting early plays. EDG definitely tried to make some plays. They went for a bot lane dive towards the beginning half of the game here, and Jackie Love super misplays it. He ults backwards on the Senna. They're able to pick up the kill there in the bottom lane. Definitely some momentum building, but, you know, Viper had a lot of the momentum in this game, and unfortunately on the Aphelios, he just wasn't able to translate that into a lot. Now, you can talk what you want about how that is a little bit Viper's fault and how he really should be able to translate a lot of what he gets on Aphelios into crazy outplays, but going into a Talia, going into a Tahm Kench, I can definitely see a world in which it's very difficult to actively make Aphelios like this hyper carry by himself. Nobody else on this team was playing all that well. My dud of the game is going to go to Scout in the mid lane on the Lissandra. He definitely has had some good games this series, but this was not one of them. He wasn't really creating all that much. I think you could credit JJ like for some bad plays as well. Overall, just not taking advantage of where I thought the power point of the map was. They had an advantage in the bot lane here with Viper, and they just weren't able to capitalize on it. So overall, definitely some worrying signs, especially because this is kind of the problem that EDG ran into at the beginning part of the regular season, where Viper would be able to generate leads, but they just wouldn't want to play entirely around him, and they would end up losing the game for it. Hopefully they can figure that out and just realize that so far throughout the playoffs and throughout the back half of the regular season, they've been very successful because they've been able to pour everything into Viper and just say, like, carry us. He did play really well in this game. It just wasn't really, it didn't matter in the long run, so hopefully they can figure that out. Outlook-wise for these two teams, obviously EDG not eliminated from playoffs because we're in top 4 now. So they just moved directly on to loser's bracket. They're going to be playing the loser of the other matchup we're going to be talking about today. But for TES, now that they've won this, they move up to winners finals, and that means that they have officially qualified for the 2022 World Championships, and that's great for them. Obviously, this team is way too talented to miss Worlds. This series was very, very close, and obviously TES definitely was in a position where they very well could have lost it, but huge win for them. It means they are guaranteed to be going to Worlds at the very least as a 1 or 2 seed. They don't even have to really worry about the regional finals, which is phenomenal for them. I think they're going to be very, very excited about that. Obviously, still some finagling to do with the rest of the seeds, depending on how the rest of the playoffs go, but great for Top Esports. It's a huge win here in Game 5. Jackie Love and Mark really stepped up, especially Mark playing a great series. So did Wayward, and so did Knight. Now, there are some worries. I honestly think Tion wasn't all that good in this series. Now, that's definitely something that they can turn around, but Tion's definitely had a little bit of a history of maybe underperforming in some playoff series and at Worlds, and it's definitely some concern for me, and I really hope that he can kind of figure it out. He definitely had some good games towards the back half of the series, but overall, I'd say he was the worst performing member of TES, and that's something to look out for. But TES is just going to be very happy about this. They move on to winners finals. They're going to be playing the winner of the other series that we're talking about today, and you know, definitely some interesting potential matchups there for them, but I think they've definitely put themselves in a good position to really run through the LPL playoffs as long as they can continue the form that they're on right now. Moving on now to our second series here of round 4. We had another really intriguing matchup, one that I don't think a lot of people were expecting to see. I think maybe EDGTS was something some people were preparing for, But even me, one of the biggest LNG believers, was not expecting to see JDG versus LNG here in the playoffs. JD Gaming versus LNG Esports is a really interesting matchup between two teams that I think are kind of on polar opposite sides of the coin. I think JDG has really been in a situation where they felt comfortable, they felt like it's their meta, they felt like a cohesive unit all year long, where it really feels like LNG has been a bunch of individual players trying to figure it out. And just recently, as in the beginning of the playoffs, or maybe week 10, they've kind of started to figure out the direction that they kind of want to go in, and they've really started to all get on the same page. And so it's a very interesting matchup, but you can make a real case that the key matchup is really what you're looking out for here. Arguably the two most talented junglers, maybe in the world, but definitely in the LPL here in Kanavi and Tarzan. At their best, I think it's really hard to discuss any two others as being the guys in the LPL quite like these two can be the guys. So really intriguing matchup there, as Kanavi has really been good all year long. He's been super consistent, in my opinion, the most consistent jungler, and Tarzan has maybe been the opposite of that. He was not really all that good for most of the year, but he's really starting to pick it up now. So how is this series going to go? Can LNG continue their winning ways against one of the best teams in the world? In game one, JDG picks up the win, although it is an incredibly close game. A very back and forth affair here in game one. Very much both teams coming out with guns a-blazing, and both with really intriguing drafts. Both that I think can work. I like LNG's, honestly, a little bit more. I'd always talk about how I think Sivir Zeri is a pretty fair trade to make if you want to give one of them up, because I really do think whichever one you invest in more is probably going to be more impactful in the late game. I think luckily for both of these teams, both of these ADCs were relatively strong and had a lot going for them moving into the back half of the game. I think the big difference here was the solo lanes, in my opinion. You had 369 and Ale, you had Yagao and Do and B. And, you know, you look at the Azir Taliyah matchup, and I think generally speaking, in my opinion, that's very Taliyah favored because she can make plays everywhere. She can set up macro plays for the rest of her team, and in this meta right now, being able to enable your entire team rather than just getting fed on yourself typically in the mid lane, I think is overall good. And I would say the same thing about the jungle matchup here. I think Poppy's just a little bit better than Velveth right now in terms of being able to make sure that things like a Sivir can get online in the late game. I would typically think that that would be a huge LNG advantage here in draft, but honestly, they don't really take advantage of it nearly as much as I would have. And honestly, Yagao and Kanavi play it relatively well here in the mid game. Even if LNG did have a lot of gold in the mid game, I think JDG actually played the early game relatively okay, making some good trades and being able to consistently put themselves in positions where at least they were going even in trades. I think when you look at the top lane matchup, it's very tank. You would think like, oh, tank matchup, probably boring, Sejuani and Anar, what really is going to happen there? But there was actually a lot of action here in the top lane, a lot of action here between Sejuani and Nar, definitely interesting there. But overall, you get to the end of the game, and you have Zeri and Azir versus Sivir, and that's kind of the problem, right? Is you have Zeri and Azir propped up by a Lulu, even Bel'Veth, Sejuani to front line. And then, unfortunately for LNG, they didn't take advantage of the window. I always talk about this. When you index into these roaming early playmaker types like Poppy, like Taliyah, you need to make sure that that Sivir can get stronger than the Zeri so that she can be that hyper carry in the late game. Unfortunately, it just didn't happen for LNG. JDG went even enough in the early game to be able to have the Azir get online, be able to have the Bel'Veth get online. You also still have the Zeri, you have the Lulu to help out with that. So JDG is able to take a lot of these fights in the late game. My player of the game here is going to go to Yagao. I thought he played the late game team fights essentially perfectly. Obviously, we talk about Yagao on Azir, that's his signature pick, but Yagao has been pretty phenomenal all year long on pretty much anything that he's wanted to play, whether it be the Azir, especially something like the Ahri, even the Taliyah. We're seeing a lot out of Yagao here, and I think that he's really shown up this year and maybe had the best year of his career. He definitely showed up in this playoff game one. He very much turned the tide of these fights in the back half here on the Azir. Basically played it nearly perfect. So really, really good game from Yagao. Very much deserves player of the game, but you got to give a lot of credit to Hope and Missing as well in the bottom lane. Obviously, the Zeri-Sivir matchup is good, but when you get to that late game of Zeri and you're not behind, you're going to be doing a bajillion damage, and Hope was absolutely coming through in the clutch with that. I was a little bit concerned with how Hope would perform in the playoffs. I kind of talked about this in my preview of this series, where obviously Hope is he's so new to the LPL that it's really one of those like, well, how is he going to hold up being on the number 2 seed in the playoffs? Kind of similar to what I was talking about with Wayward, but he really showed up here in game one, played it really well. Missing definitely helped out with that a lot. Missing being a very, very good support definitely helped out with that a lot. And I think overall, JDG played the game well. As for LNG, not all that bad of a game, really. They were definitely in a position to win this, and I think a lot of that just had to do with they just needed to take more risks in the early game. They needed to move this Leah with the Poppy. They needed to make sure that that Sivir got super far ahead. Obviously, JDG, I think, did a really good job of making sure that didn't happen, but you still got to make sure that you have the options available to you, and this comp is entirely predicated, in the late game at least, around Sivir being really strong. And so if Zeri is just able to output the same amount of damage that Sivir is, you're really not in a position to be able to win these team fights. Unfortunately, the gold went on to Doenby, and it went on to Ale, who really didn't do anything with it towards the back half of this game. You can talk about Ale all you want being like really good in the rounds before this. I think he got kind of outclassed by 369, at least in team fights in terms of this game. Obviously, the Gnar and Sejuani matchup is just kind of boring overall, but he really didn't do anything towards the back half. I wanted to see more out of him, and unfortunately, we didn't get that. Unfortunately, like, I would say I am nitpicking a little bit here. I think Ale was fine, but somebody had to get the dud of the game here because everybody, all 10 players, I think, played relatively well in this game, and unfortunately, that falls on Ale. But overall, outlook-wise for LNG, I certainly think they have options here, and I don't even think that the ones that they went for in this game were really all that bad of choices. I just don't think they were able to execute it quite on the way that they thought they would. Clearly, indexing super hard into that Sivir is maybe not the way to go. Spreading out the resources a bit, I think, has really helped them out a lot in playoffs so far, and I think it will continue to help them out in this series. But for JDG, this is both a good and a bad sign. I think a bad sign in the sense of I really don't know if you put yourself in a great position in draft because you're super indexed into late game, but you played the early game so well and went so even that you got to that point in the game where you could just take it over. And that is a really good sign that even when you're at a disadvantage in terms of your picks, I really think they came through and were able to make it work in a way that I think was really well done. So congrats to JDG on that regard, but can they keep it up now? Moving into Game 2, and Game 2 is another JDG win. They go up 2-0. I always talk about it. 2-0 is pretty much a death sentence for any team, so a big win here for JDG to be able to get that here. And my player of the game, again, is going to go to Yagao. I think a lot of people are going to talk about 369 in the top lane on this Renekton, and don't worry, we will get to him. But man, Yagao is so good at this game. Like, this is a really interesting matchup here. I think Sylas into Talia, because I think they both relatively do similar things here. I think Yagao obviously holds a bigger purpose in the late game, whereas Talia, I think, just wants to make those proactive plays earlier in the game, which again, definitely a run it back style comp here from LNG, but Yagao I just thought Yagao played it so well. Sylas is a pick that actually can be surprisingly mobile and surprisingly macro oriented, and especially when you throw out the Morgana here in the jungle, which I do really like. There are a lot of interesting things you can do here. Morgana is a really interesting pick into Poppy as a whole, and honestly into Zeri as well, especially in the early game if you want to make plays around that bot lane, and they certainly did, honestly. The 4-man plays bot, even just the ganks mid lane, like getting Yagao ahead on the Sylas was a really important part of what JDG wanted to do in this game, and it absolutely worked for them. You can talk about the Lucian Nami really stopping a lot of what the Poppy Talia wants to do, and I agree with that. I think obviously Lucian Nami is a little bit more risky than something like a Sivir as an answer, as a counter here to the Zeri, because you're not going to scale nearly as well, but you do have a much higher percentage chance to get ahead of her, and then you're just kind of in a good spot. I think if you do get that Lucian Nami, if you play around that, you get Sylas gold, you get Morgana gold, you're actually in a really interesting position because that Black Shield is so huge, not only against Talia, but against Zeri, against Poppy. Like, there's so many things that Black Shield actually helps you for that I really think that getting that Morgana ahead, getting her in a position where she can be super duper strong, like max that Black Shield quickly, get some AP rolling, and you get Yagao to the point where he can frontline like fully for this team. You have Lucian and Renekton being problems on the backside. Like, JDG actually has a really interesting comp here that I think they executed really well. So yeah, Yagao's my player of the game, but we'll get to it. You got to talk about 369 in this. The broadcast gave him player of the game, and I totally understand because there was a ton of resources dedicated to this top lane here on the Renekton. And I kind of like this idea overall. If you're going to pick the Renekton, especially into something like Gnar, which scales relatively well, you have, you want to get that advantage. Like, you want to push that if you feel like that is a strong point of your map. And I think 369 and Kanavi did a really good job of that as well. Yagao moving top lane as well. A lot of interesting plays here. Ale was completely obliterated in this game. It really wasn't all that close in terms of a top lane matchup. The top gap, the top canyon, I should say, was very huge. 369 really showing up. He's been the best top laner in the LPL, in my opinion, for the entirety of 2022. And he's really proving that here. Ale being a very good player, arguably the best top laner in playoffs so far. And 369 absolutely demolishes him here in Game 2 on the Renekton. A very good game from here. A lot of people are going to want to give him player of the game here for me. But for me, I think Yigao just had a little bit more of an impact on the map overall and was really, really solid. So really good draft from JDG, but even better execution. I really, really like what they did here. As for LNG, again, you kind of run it back here with a similar style comp of you want to use that Taliyah and Poppy to help out your bot lane and to really get that bot lane ahead, but unfortunately you just don't play it well. Like, this is starting to feel like the LNG of old again, where it just doesn't feel like everything is all that connected. This is a comp that really requires your mid-jungle duo to be moving as a unit, and it really doesn't feel like they are. Obviously, Light and Lumao do lose the bot lane matchup, but, you know, in the 2v2, they probably should, obviously, into Lucian Nami. That's just a stronger early game, and if you don't really get a lot of help there, it's going to be more difficult for Zeri to scale up into the late game. But Light, you need Light for this late game. Without him, I don't really see a way for you to be able to carry the game. But if you're going to talk about not playing well, you got to talk about Ale in the top lane, who's easily the dud of the game here. He got it in game 1, kind of just because he had to. Like, nobody else really even messed up all that much, and Ale was just kind of the one that I felt was a little bit lower on the totem pole. But in game 2, he absolutely deserves it. This was a pretty pitiful performance from Ale here on the Gnar. Completely outclassed by 369's Renekton, and if you're an LNG fan, you just gotta hope that this doesn't keep up, because this team really relies on their top lane being strong in order to facilitate a lot of plays around the map, being able to at least hold up in that 1v1 without resources. Tarzan almost never goes top lane, and so you're really relying on Ale to create a lot of pressure for himself in that top lane, or at least negate a lot of the pressure that's thrown his way, and unfortunately for LNG, he could not do that in this game. But overall, not a great game, I would say. For LNG, this is probably one of the worst games they've had in playoffs so far. They're down 0-2, not exactly where you want to be. Light really isn't able to get online because they're not really investing the resources into him that they need to. He's really been the carry of this team, and they're kind of ignoring him, and that's definitely weird, but you gotta credit JDG. They're just outplaying them. That jungle mid duo has been devastating for everybody all year long, Kanavi and Yigao, and it's clearly doing numbers here because Tarzan and Doenb they've been very good throughout the playoffs, but Kanavi and Yigao are just simply on a different level, at least through the first 2 games. So can that change? Can that be turned around? Can you adjust that for Game 3? Well, moving on to Game 3 now, we see that it cannot. It is a Game 3 win, and it is our first sweep here in the LPL as JDG wins in 3 games, and just a dominant series. Like, this was never really all that in doubt. I actually think LNG's draft here is pretty interesting and could be something that works out, but overall, it just didn't. You flex the Renekton to the mid lane. You've got the Zac in the jungle. You've got Kog'Maw Lulu in the bot lane to try and counteract the Lucian Nami to be able to scale up into Oblivion, but you really have to execute on a draft like this, and I just don't think that they were able to do that. Let's talk about what JDG did well. Kanavi, the best jungler in the LPL, maybe the best jungler in the world. Him versus Peanut, I think you're definitely going to have a fun debate talking about that, but Kanavi was really, really solid in this game on the Sejuani. Obviously, Seja pick that Kanavi has really liked to go to in previous years. Tarzan, the same thing. Honestly, probably the pick that I would consider the Tarzan the most famous for, at least at this point. But Kanavi actually takes this one and does a really good job at negating the gank pressure that I think Zac gives a lot of in the early game. Obviously, Zac's kind of a weird pick because he's a little bit of a hybrid of he wants to scale into the late game because he's a tank. He gets a lot more tanky in the late game, but, you know, his passive and his ability to gank really indicate more of an early game aggressive playstyle, at least in the pro scene, and you can try to take advantage of that with the Renekton, but you can also play it passive and move into the late game with something like the Kog'Maw or something like the Gnar. Unfortunately for Tarzan, he didn't really do either in this game. Kanavi got a lot of early pressure in this game, moving bot lane, making sure Lucian had some gold, and then Yigao did a really good job of translating a lot of the macro advantage on the Taliyah to pretty much wherever he needed it to be, whether that be Dragons, whether that be Herald, whether that be bot lane, wherever it needed to be. Yigao was doing a really good job of making sure that there was always a man advantage for JDG, and Doenb just wasn't able to keep up with that, because really Renekton into Taliyah, like, how are you going to match? Really, a lot of this game was centered around the bot lane for LNG. You're going into Lucian Nami, you just have to survive the laning phase, and you'll get to a point where Kog'Maw should be able to turret kill pretty much everybody in this game, as long as he has some level of gold. There's really nobody on JDG that has a lot of engage tools or really an ability to beat him up as long as he doesn't walk into Taliyah shove or something like that. But overall, unfortunately for Light, he did not play the early game well at all. In fact, he's my dud of the game here for a lot of his positioning mistakes here on Kog'Maw. He has to know that he can't really trade with the Lucian early game. Like, that's pretty obvious, I think, for me and a lot of other people here, but Light seemingly thought differently, tried to go for a lot of aggressive plays, and it just very much did not work out for LNG. So unfortunately, Light's going to get my dud of the game here, and I think with a better performance from him, this might have been a more interesting game and a more interesting series, but at the end of the day, JDG was just so much better than LNG in this series that I can't even really imagine that, even if Light was playing at his absolute best. Like, Tarzan and Doenby and Ale were completely outclassed on the top side, and Lumao never really played all that well. So overall, great series from JDG. This is one of the most dominant series we've seen in the playoffs in any region so far this year, not just because it's a sweep, but because of how the games have actively played out. Like, JDG has just so clearly been better. Player of the series is no shock, it's Yagao. He was so ridiculously good in the series. He outplayed Doenby to such a ridiculous extent, and honestly even outplayed Tarzan to such a ridiculous extent on these more roaming, active playmakers, whether it be, getting ahead on Azir, kind of, making sure that he doesn't get super far behind and that the Taliyah can't make a ton of macro plays in the early game in game one, whether it be the Sylas being able to match a lot of those plays that Taliyah makes, and then being able to frontline super well, or on this game, on the Taliyah himself, being able to be exactly wherever he needed. Yagao was basically perfect in this series, and this really is a showcase of what JDG really is. Kanavi was really good. 369 dominated Ale in this series, even if it wasn't like a dominant game 3. That game 2 was disgusting. And then Hope and Missing were just better. You can talk about Light and Lumao not getting invested in, but Hope and Missing really did a good job of playing that Lucian Nami early game lane lead to great effect. And even in game 1 where they were on the Zeri, they just did a better job of scaling into that late game than Light did here on the Sivir. So overall, JDG was just the better team across the board, and that's a very good sign. Like I said earlier, for EDG, this isn't the end of the season for LNG. They're going to be playing Edward Gaming here in the losers bracket. We're going to be previewing that here in just a bit, but they definitely still have a chance to bounce back. This isn't the most comforting of losses, but at the end of the day, it's still Tarzan, Doenby, Light. You still have a ridiculously good trio there, Ale as well. Even Lumao, I think, has been playing well in the playoffs. You still definitely have a lot of options here. Your top 4 for a reason, but you're definitely gonna have to get some of that mojo back after what was a pretty disastrous series here. As for JDG, I mean, the momentum and the confidence has to be through the roof right now. They move on to a series against TES, which I'm excited to cover. Definitely some things to talk about there, but they are on cloud 9 right now. No NA pun intended there, but they have to be feeling phenomenal about how they've been playing recently and just how they played all year. This team might be the best team in the LPL, and it might not even be that close. We're certainly going to be talking about that later, but overall, just a dominant win from JDG, and I really hope that they can keep it up. Well, that's going to do it for my round 4 upper bracket recaps. It's time to preview the next 2 series. Not only do we have losers semifinals here, we have winners finals to preview. A lot of interesting, 2 interesting matchups from the teams we just talked about. Really, really excited to get into that. But we're going to get into our losers semifinals first, our lower bracket, beginner here, the first matchup of the lower bracket. We've got Edward Gaming, EDG, taking on LNG Esports. 2 teams that I think are really happy just to be in this situation. Not a lot of expectedness, I think, from them in this case. But both showing throughout the playoffs so far that they definitely at least deserve to be in the conversation overall. And it's going to be a really interesting matchup here between EDG and LNG. I think definitely closer to a 2021 matchup between both of these teams. I think we're going to be looking at some of the same things we were looking at last year with a few changes. Obviously, JJ versus Tarzan is huge for this series. Both players have kind of been on a little bit of a downswing so far in 2022. I think the difference between those two really isn't all that big right now. In fact, if I had to say, I would think Tarzan was playing a little bit better in playoffs, but that's just the expectation here. If JJ can really turn it around and get back to his 2021 form, or even just really invest a lot into bot lane like Junjia has been doing, I think JJ is the better player than Junjia. I just think he doesn't really have the same kind of mentality, and that mentality has really been helping out EDG. So it's going to be a very interesting jungle matchup here. I also think you've got to look at top lane. That's what everybody looked at last year when these two teams faced off, was Flandre and Ale, 2 players who had huge breakouts last year, and both who play, honestly, relatively aggressive styles. Ale likes to play forward. He likes to play the Gwen. He likes to play the Gnar. Flandre, very similar, likes to play the Gnar, likes to play the Gangplank, likes to play the Gragas. So some very interesting matchups here that I think both can, really push forward on. Flandre versus Ale, I think, is definitely going to be something that a lot of people are looking at. But we can also look at what is the new matchup here between EDG and LNG, Scout versus Doenby. Now, a very intriguing matchup between 2 players that honestly play relatively similar, but in different ways, right? Like, I think Scout had been used to getting a lot of resources and being able to translate that elsewhere. Doenby doing the same thing, right? Like, someone who wants to play the Corki or the Swain, who wants to be able to, kind of be the central focus of LNG, but also use that central focus to move elsewhere. I think Scout really made that popular in 2021, and both of these teams were really trying to still force that playstyle throughout a majority of the year. Now, I think a lot of these teams have found their success moving away from that, whether it be on the Taliyah, whether it be on, I don't know, like the Sylas or something like that, the Ari. I think really a lot of these teams, both of these teams have found success moving away from their mid laners, or moving away from at least putting their mid laners on such a responsibility and moving towards putting their bot laners on it. But Scout and Doanby are still going to be a huge matchup to watch, and it's still going to be a very interesting one to keep track of. But that brings us to our key matchup of the series here, and this is really a meta matchup at this point, but it really is the two players on both of these teams that have kind of been the central focus for a lot of their wins, and when these teams are going well, these two players are playing well. Of course, I'm talking about the bot lane matchup here between Viper and Light. Now, it's definitely interesting. Viper is definitely a very good player, and so is Light. But Viper kind of does what Light does a little bit better. Both of these teams, I think, at their best, are focusing on that bot lane, putting them on a late game carry, a Sivir, a Zeri, something like that, Nephelios, and just saying, like, go, or even a Draven. Like, both of these two can play that. And just saying, like, we're going to invest in you, and you're going to win us the game. I think both of these teams really like that, and I think that playstyle is really going to be the contested thing about this series. Obviously, EDG dominated in the regular season because this was before LNG figured out that investing into Light was the way to go, and before, you know, Tarzan and Doanby really got on the same page. But there are definitely still things that LNG has that I think they can do really well. I actually think that they might have the better mid-jungle duo, at least when things go well for Tarzan and Doanby, which I think is possible. But I think that really you're going to have to take that advantage and use it to make sure that Light gets in a good spot, because it really is a super bot-focused meta, and if Light is in a bad spot against, in my opinion, one of the best AD carries in the world here, it's going to be very difficult. EDG, on the other hand, I think definitely worries me in the sense of, I definitely think LNG sometimes understands that they have to invest into Light and make sure that he gets ahead. I feel like EDG maybe understands that sometimes a little bit less. If Viper's not the central focus of EDG's game plan, they often struggle, even against bad teams. And so it's definitely going to be interesting to see how both of these teams match up. I think both teams are going to realize that this bot lane matchup is the key to opening up the series, and whichever one gets more investment, I really think is going to be the one that wins. EDG was able to do that in the regular season, but I think it's going to be a lot more controversial here come playoff time. But overall, very interesting matchup between EDG and LNG. I think a lot of people are going to see this as pretty one-sided, but overall, I definitely think there are avenues for both teams to win, and I'll get to my predictions in a little bit, just after we talk about both of the series here. That brings us to our other matchup here, and this is our winners bracket finals here. The two teams that won today, the two best teams in the region in terms of record, Top Esports taking on JD Gaming. Now, JDG did take the regular season matchup between these two, but I talked about this a little bit in my preview. It was week 1 of the regular season, so much has happened since then. So many different things have happened to both of these teams since then. Definitely not quite the same teams that they were at that moment, but it's still an incredibly interesting matchup, and just profiling what these two teams match up against each other like, I think is very, very intriguing. We start with the bot lane here because, honestly, for TES, it's really been about the bot lane a lot this year. Whether JackeyLove shows up, JackeyLove and Mark obviously play so aggressive and so in front that sometimes when they show up, it doesn't really matter what happens else on the map. Like, they can just win the games by themselves. But on the same time, they can be taken advantage of. And I've talked about Hope and Missing. Maybe they're not on the same level as some of the other bot lanes that I've talked about. Maybe not. They're not Viper and Mako, right? But they're still a very good bot lane. And honestly, the introduction of Hope and his pairing up with Missing is really what unlocked JD Gaming to become one of the best teams in the world. So there are a lot of good things to talk about with this matchup, but JackeyLove and Mark should theoretically have the advantage here, just in terms of, you know, talent level, but that's a lane that could be punishable. On the flip side, you've got Wayward versus 369. Not only is this an incredibly interesting matchup because of 369 versus Top Esports, but it's the #1 top laner in the region versus the rookie of the year, in my opinion, in Wayward here in the top lane. A very, very, very intriguing matchup. Can Wayward hold up? That's really going to be the conversation. 369 has been dominating pretty much everybody that he's played against. He was playing against Ale earlier in this video, and he completely dominated him, and Ale's been very good over the course of the playoffs. Can Wayward, the rookie, hold up? He had a very good series here against EDG, was able to go up against Flandre and definitely hold his own. 369 is a completely different story. He's going to be playing these more aggressive picks, but even when he's on the tanks, he plays them very actively, and Wayward does like to play active as well on things like the Gwen. So it's going to be a very interesting dichotomy between those two. And that's not even talking about the mid lane matchup, which at the beginning of the year I would have said is super Top Esports favored. But I think at this point in the season, Knight versus Yagao is just about the best mid lane matchup that you're going to be getting pretty much anywhere in the world. Like, Knight and Yagao are so devastating, like, for their teams, and they're so influential, kind of in similar ways, but also in different ways, where Knight, I think, likes to take a little bit more resources and disperse them. I think Yagao has been really, really good at just being a nuisance for everybody, especially the enemy jungler on the enemy team, being exactly where he needs to be all the time to take over the game and to make his jungler's job as easy as possible. I think that the macro sense of these two players is going to be incredibly important and is really going to dictate the pace at which this game is played at. But you'll notice I'm missing out on the key matchup. It should be no surprise. It is in the jungle. It's Tian versus Kanavi here as my key matchup of the series. It's the MVP versus, in my opinion, the best jungler in the region. So, I mean, how can it not be? Really, definitely some interesting matchups here. I think Tian definitely has a lot to prove in this matchup. A lot of people calling his MVP a little suspect. You know, I'm not saying I'm one of them. I definitely think Tian had a good year, but I'm kind of on that page as well. I thought Kanavi was even just a better jungler. But Tian absolutely has the chance to prove it in this series. It's going to be an incredibly intriguing matchup. Both of these teams, especially JDG, revolve around their jungle play. Like I said, while Yagao has been very good, a lot of what he's done well is be able to influence the jungle matchup in a way that creates a lot of pressure for JDG and for Kanavi in particular to be able to take over. That's why Kanavi has such high damage numbers, is because he really has such an easy time of taking over the map because of his supporting cast. Tian, on the other hand, a little bit more of the supportive style. You'll notice his damage numbers really aren't nearly as high. His KP percentage isn't as high either, nearly at 65%. But what he does is play off his mid laner basically perfectly. Knight and Tian are probably the best jungle mid duo in the world in terms of a combination, and that's because Tian can really get Knight in a position where Knight can take over the game, whereas I think oppositely, Yagao can get Kanavi in a position where Kanavi can take over the game. I really think it's going to be an intriguing matchup between these two. Both have the chance to prove that they are the #1 jungler in the region, and I think that's going to be the matchup that me and pretty much everybody else is looking forward to. But I mean, really, could we ask for a better winners finals? These are the two teams that we wanted to see the most play off in the playoffs here, so I can't even imagine what's going to happen in a couple of days with this matchup, but I am so pumped and so excited to watch it nonetheless. I'm just happy that we get to see what is probably the two best teams in the world right now face off against each other in playoffs. All right, that is going to do it for my Round 4 overview and analysis of both of the series, as well as my previews for the two series that we have upcoming here in the LPL. Now it's time for some predictions, so let's talk about EDG LNG. I think this is going to be an interesting series, but at the end of the day, EDG should be able to take this. I wouldn't expect a lot of pushback there. Honestly, if it's Viper versus Light that really is deciding the series, Viper should have a pretty huge advantage in that matchup, so I'm going to take EDG either in a 3-0 or a 3-1. I really think this will be pretty simple for EDG. I don't think LNG, unfortunately, has the firepower to be able to match. Even if the mid-jungle duo does really step up and start to perform, I really think there are some holes in that team that I just think can be exploited by EDG. They might get one, they might even get two, but at the end of the day, EDG should probably be coming out on top in that one. As for Top Esports versus JD Gaming, obviously a matchup everybody wants to see. It's really difficult to pick between these two teams because I really think that both of them do things very similarly and very interestingly, but I'm going to stick with my pre-playoff predictions here, and I'm going to go with JD Gaming. I still think JDG is my pick here in this series. I hope it'll go to 5, and I hope TES can bounce back, but those are going to be my picks here. I'm going to be picking JDG over TES, and I'm going to be picking EDG over LNG. So some very interesting matchups that I'm really excited for. But yeah, I hope you guys are excited as well, and I hope you guys are enjoying the content. If you are, it really does help me out a lot if you go ahead and leave a like. And if you are interested in watching more of this playoff content that I'm putting out, whether it be for the LPL, the LCK, the LCS, LEC, all 4 of the major regions, also Worlds content coming up, I highly recommend that you subscribe, hit the bell. That's the way to get all the notifications about when these videos are dropping every single day. So really hope you guys are enjoying the content. Let me know down in the comment section below who you guys think are going to be winning these two series, because certainly there are going to be some that are up for debate, and I think TSJDG is going to cause a lot of fun discussion down in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.